Thanks for inviting me to this guest lecture. It's a pleasure presenting my research here in this forum. The whole session today was entitled Tools for Co-Creating and Scenarios and Alternatives. And I'd like to entitle, well, my talk, and I will get doing the next, well, 45 minutes, Co-Designing Collaborative Planning Support Tools to Engage Stakeholders in Planning and Decision Making. Kees van Westen said already a little bit, so I'm an associate professor here at the Faculty of Geoinformation Science, but I'm in a different department. I'm in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, and that's more the corner from which I'm coming to the topic. So I'm a geographer by background with a strong focus on spatial planning, of urban planning, and in that field I develop, well, co-design tools, and that's what I want to talk about today. Just one more sentence. Kees mentioned that already. I'm the head of a lab that we have here at the faculty. We call it in short the DISC. It's a design and interactive space for co-creating, where we develop tools, where we develop applications and strategies, and that's most of the activities that I present today are related to this, to the lab and the works that we do here. A little bit very quickly on an overview. By the way, Kees, if there's any questions in between, I'm happy to take these. If there's urgent questions, I don't know how you handle it, but you would have to signal it because I don't see the group, of course. But if there's urgent questions, give me a second.
So if you want to ask a question in the meantime, you can just raise your hand, and then I will inform Johan.
Okay, thanks. So this is an overview of my talk. So I would like to discuss first a bit more conceptually and also theoretically why co-designing tools. Why do we talk about co-design since a couple of years? And that has, in my view, very much to do with a concept that is being public or around there for a couple of years, what we call the implementation gap. And I'll be explaining in a minute what I mean with that. Then I will present two examples of co-design process that we organized in our lab in two different projects with different types of stakeholders. And I will wrap up my talk with a little bit of a discussion and conclusion, but I try to keep it short, but I'm open for more discussion and questions in the end. So why do we do co-designing of tools, and what does that have to do with the implementation gap? I can't start without showing that slide in the beginning, a slide that my colleague Richard Sluices often shows. When we talk about spatial planning, when we talk about urban planning, there are many, many different definitions of what urban planning means, and a very short, but for me and for my work, very crucial explanation is, well, planning is in first instance a process of intersubjective communication of many, many different stakeholders talking together, as you see visualized here in this cartoon, in this figure. So many people around the table, literally discussing, having ideas, having conflicting ideas and plans and strategies, how to improve cities and urban regions. And planning is the task, the disciplines to bring all these different ideas together. And in line in this idea of how we conceptualize and how we frame planning is the work that I do, the research that I do and that I want to present today, and also the work that we do here in the DISC. I've written it down. So our work in the DISC is basically on interactive geospatial tools for planning and decision support. So what I do in my research mainly is we develop geospatial tools and methods. And in my field, we call it planning support systems, so PSS in short. You will see that acronym later on. And we develop these tools to support the active participation of stakeholders in addressing societal problems related, for instance, to the SDGs. May it be on climate adaptation, may it be on the energy transition, may it be to disaster risk mitigation and adaptation, and other topics, environmental health. The idea of these tools that we develop, and that relates to the cartoon that I was just showing on the slide before, it's to strengthen and to improve the communication and collaboration between the different stakeholders, which is the key asset or the key activity of what planners do. And the work that I do, that we do in our lab, in my team and me, we develop such tools, and you see a lot of images here that we illustrate, and I will explain a bit in the next slide what this technology is there. So we develop such tools, but we also apply these tools in planning processes, or we do workshops with stakeholders to use the tools, to test the tools, and we also evaluate what are the outcomes of such processes and what are the outcomes of using such tools. If you want to understand a bit more about our lab, the DISC, I put a link here, so feel free to click there and send me an email if you want to ask other questions. As you can see on much of the images, and I would like to spend one extra slide on that, we use a particular type of hardware in particular in our lab that we develop tools for, and that is this kind of interactive touch surface that we put flat on the table. We call it a map table, and it's not only us doing the research, but many colleagues in the Netherlands, but also in other countries are using such tools and developing geospatial tools, planning support systems in particular for such tools and for such hardware pieces. And why do we do that? Well, there's quite some research and evidence that when you develop tools, user-friendly tools, and you make stakeholders interact with that around such a table, so stakeholders stand around the table and interact with the tool, it improves what we call the fluidity of the user content interaction. So it speeds up the collaboration. It's more supporting the interaction with the content when having it on the wall or sitting in the classroom. It has a positive influence on working style and group dynamics that has been tested in several more experimental type of studies. And it enhances, and that's what we aim for with achieving, with using such tools, it enhances interaction between different stakeholders. So in a nutshell, what I always explain in lectures or with students, the moment that I put stakeholders around such a table and give them a certain task, or they work with a certain tool on a certain case study and context, they start talking to each other. They interact with the content on the screen, and that would be nice to show it here, but we can't do it really in an online lecture. But they start talking to each other and they shape arguments. And that's something what we aim for, that what we try to achieve with developing, with co-designing the tools that we do. And that is particularly what you achieve in a horizontal environment when you put it on flat on a table. It's not so much when you put it to a wall, because then the way of interaction between the different stakeholders would be somewhat different. But of course, developing such tool is one thing, but of course you need to make tools, or we aim to make tools that are also that are used in practice and they're useful. And there I'd like to distinguish briefly two concepts that we use for evaluating how good or not good such tools are. And these are the concepts of usability and usefulness of a planning support system, of any geospatial tool. And to distinguish the two, so usability for us means, well, how good is the tool design? How well can users make use of the provided functionality? So do they understand all the buttons? Can they use the functions of the tool? And the usefulness on the other side describes how useful is such a tool to enhance the planning practice. The interaction of the stakeholders with respect to the goals of the process, with the outcomes. Yeah. Both concepts, usability and usefulness, are closely related and depend on each other. So only if you make tools, if you co-design, and that's what we do, co-design tools that have a high usability, then you are likely also to achieve usefulness in the way that the tool is useful to inform the planning process, the risk assessment, the whatever type of process you do. And I added here a definition, what we mean with usefulness. Usability might be more familiar to some of you already. So usefulness we define, or Peter Pelzer in his study defined a couple of years ago, as a positive improvement of the planning practice, which really happens, we do anyhow, in comparison to a situation where no PSS will be applied. So that is, in a nutshell, how we understand usefulness of such tools. The next slide. Why is my slide not moving now? Okay. So now I come to this implementation gap, because since a couple of years in our literature, and the literature that we, well, as spatial planners, well, publish in, but well, also in relation to decision support system, is a very similar feature. And you have may notice this, is what is called the implementation gap. And the implementation gap is something that you might be familiar or not yet. So it's, in short, well, a limited uptake of geospatial tools in planning practice. So in universities and research institutions, many tools are being developed, planning support systems, decision support systems for different contexts and for different tasks and goals. But when you look into planning practice, and that's what we work with a lot, such tools are often not used, are not taken up. And that is what is described as the implementation gap. So there is a gap between what tools the planning practice requires and the functionality that tools that are being developed in science are developed. So the planning support system do not match what the users need to perform their planning tasks, developing scenarios, assessing situations, developing different designs and whatsoever. So for different tasks, there seems to be a mismatch. This study that I refer to here from Guido Funk from 2006 is a bit outdated, but also from my everyday observations, from my practice, it's getting better. We are on that way, but there's still a gap, and still practice is not making use so much of these tools as it should be, as they are developed in academia and science. This next slide gives a bit more details from that study from Guido Funk. What are the reasons from that survey? It was a survey that he has done then. What are the shortcomings? Why such tools are often not useful? And that well, you see here a list of comments, feedback given from the survey. So the tools are either, well, or many of them are not transparent. They have a low communication value. They are too complicated. They're not user-friendly, which refers to the aspect of usability that I was just showing. They're not interactive. They are too rigid. And I don't read out the others. So many different aspects that refer to the design of the tool that are not good, and therefore are not able, or they're not well to be used in planning practice, what we aim for. So, and that adds my bridge now to the co-design, because co-design is since a couple of years discussed as one solution to overcome this implementation gap. So why do we co-design tools? Because we want to make tools that are better used in planning practice by practitioners, by planners, by stakeholders to inform processes beyond academic projects and beyond the end of the project, that the tool is used by the municipality, by the planning agency being in charge. So when co-design is a solution, the first question for me is, well, what is co-design? It's very hot. It's a buzzword nowadays when you look into literature, but it makes sense to have a bit of, well, what do we mean with co-design? I looked up a couple of definitions. One from a paper from Sanders and Stubbers from 2008. They say, and I just quote here, co-design is a specific instance of co-creation. That does not have much. But then in the next sentence of the same paper, they say co-creation refers to any act of collective creativity. And that, for me, is a more helpful discussion or definition already. So a collective creativity means a creative act of more than one person. So at least two persons, ideally more persons, working together, creatively designing something together. And that is co-creation and co-design. I come with a better definition afterwards, but that gives some ideas already. So it's a bit of a creative act of designing things together. And just because I see in literature nowadays all this co-design, co-creation, and there are many more of these things. I just very quickly show here this paper from Beauvoir and Loeffler, where they distinguish co-planning, co-design. It's a bit a fashion nowadays also, and I'm not very convinced it has to always be stressed like that, but don't be surprised when you come across it, and try to look always behind the scene, what is meant with co-design and what is co-managing, what distinguishes it from co-financing. Anyhow, for our purpose and for my talk, I like to stick and refer to definition that I'm giving here now below. So co-design is a design-led process that uses creative participatory methods, and that's the most important part of that definition, There's no one-size-fits-all approach or no set checklist to follow. Instead, there are a series of patterns and principles that can be deployed in different ways with different people. So in other words, every co-design process that we conduct or that others conduct is to some degree different. There is no one way of how to do co-design, but it depends on many different factors. And this what this sentence says, what this definition says, I'd like to illustrate now. Oh, sorry, there's one more point that I just want to make before I come to my two examples. So what I said so far, what we do is basically co-design of geospatial tools, and that's what I will show in the two examples in the two studies that I will present in the next minutes. So we co-design together with stakeholders, with users, geospatial tools, planning support systems. But of course, you can also, and I know my colleague Nadeya, who gives the next talk today, she rather talks about co-design of spatial plans and strategies. And indeed, both can be co-designed along the lines that we have discussed. And that's why I put these two arrows here on the right. Co-designing tools and co-designing plans and strategies has a close relation, very similar to the link between usability and usefulness that I showed just before. I would claim if geospatial tools are well co-designed, that means co-designed together with users to make them more useful and usable, then also you have a better chance that strategies and plans are co-designed. So that's why co-design can have multiple meanings. You can have different meanings. And whenever you say, I'm co-designing something, get clear what you co-design. Do you design a tool? Do you design plans? But there are close relations, as I try to show with this figure here. I hope that makes sense. Let me know if there's any question for that first part. Otherwise, I will move now forward. I'd like to present two examples of different co-design processes, very much in the line of what I just said, that not every co-design process is same, but well, there are different ways of designing tools together with stakeholders. And I'd like to present two different examples. The first one was on a project, a PhD project that we did with a PhD student until last year, for the last five years. It was on co-designing a tool for participatory noise action planning. And my second example that I will present today is then a study that we conducted in the last year in our lab. It's on inclusive collaborative mapping of accessibility to public spaces for people with disabilities. I will explain a bit more details when I come to these two case studies and how we do. That was my purpose of this now. How we organize the co-design, because we organize it significantly different in both cases. So let me start with the first example, co-designing a tool for participatory noise action planning. So just a very little bit on the background. Every city in Europe has to have, because of an EU directive that was written and approved in 2014, I think, every city has to have a noise action plan, a plan where the city, the municipality says, what kind of actions do we take within the city to mitigate noisy situation, noise from streets, noise from transport systems, railroad and light rail systems, but also noise from industrial production and so on. And one element in that EU directive says even that the noise action planning requires the participation of citizens. So citizens are supposed to be asked what are noisy and quiet areas that you want to preserve, or where you feel this this noisy situation is perceived, the subjective noise perception has to be taken into account. And the planners have to deal with these inputs of citizens. And for that purpose, we co-designed a tool that supports a digital tool on a map table, as I showed in the very beginning. We co-designed a tool that supports this kind of participatory noise action planning. And what you see here in the figure is, well, a cycle, a process, starting here on the right side with the PSS tool conceptualization. But that was the entire co-design process that we went through in this process. I will very quickly go through the different boxes. So it starts here. We had already a PSS tool conceptualization, the broad tool idea of what the PSS tool should do. It should work on a map table. It should integrate different stakeholders. But then we engaged with the stakeholders. I explain in a minute who the stakeholders were. Engage with them and user requirements by let them write user stories. These user stories, and I explain in my next slide what we mean with user stories. With having these user stories, we analyzed them. We went to producing design solutions for different stories, applying agile software development principles, a very quick, rapid sprints of 4 to 6 weeks of defining software solutions, evaluating these kind of software solutions for particular tasks of user stories coined by the users together with the users. So you see all this iteration error. So, and once we have a kind of a prototype of the tool that we felt was working and was reviewed by the by the stakeholders, by the users, we went to do an evaluation of the prototype in a kind of controlled condition with our students, for instance, or with other stakeholders who were not part of the design and of the user story writing, so of the specifying of the user requirements, before we went into the workshop where we applied the tool to do participatory noise action planning. And that then, well, ideally, the tool that was co-designed fits the user requirement and matches and does the job. And if not, then you would even go to in the next round of user design. But well, basically we came up to here and we had a tool and then we used it in workshops. But this is an overall view of how we defined that co-design process in this research study. And I will now in the next slides look a bit more in particular on these 3 steps of the slides. Please give me a signal when I'm running out of time, because I see that time is flying a little bit and I have still a couple of slides to go. So, but we start a bit later if I'm not mistaken.
It's okay, Johannes.
Okay.
Please. Yeah.
Thank you. So then let me show a little bit more how we structured the co-design process for this particular tool. The first step of the user story writing. Indeed. So we started with our partners, the stakeholders, the users in the process. And in this case, the users were domain experts. I mean, they had knowledge on noise, on the problem of noise in urban areas. Some of them were familiar with the process of noise action planning and had even done a workshop on that. And they also had knowledge on GIS and on participation, and some of them even had worked with a map table before. So we had quite expert stakeholders that we worked with, that we did the co-design process in this case. And that's why we choose the following sequence. So we asked them to write user stories, and we'll present some user stories in the next slide. Then we analyzed user stories, and all these steps I will explain in the coming slides. Asked in parallel, more or less, users to prioritize the user stories that we captured in a follow-up workshop, and that led to the design of prototypes. So for each user story, we made a bit of a mock-up how that feature of the tool can be designed and implemented in the software. From that, we generate a prototype, and we had then the last workshop was an overall user story conversation where we reflected these mock-ups, and we had finalized and agreed on a set of user stories to be implemented, and that made the basis for the programming, the coding for the development of the tool. So that was the overall process of the user story writing. To give you an idea, if you have never seen some sort of user story writing, user stories is very much a structured and very clearly defined process. So a user story says a certain persona wants to perform a certain task to achieve a certain goal. Or as a user role, I want to perform that task to achieve this goal. So in our example we asked the users, what kind of user stories you want to write or you have for the map table tool that we want to develop. they came, for instance, our stakeholders came up with statements like, as a citizen, I want to show where I get influenced by noise so that these areas can get attention, e.g., for example, from the government. Or another user story, just to give you some ideas of that, as a decision maker, I want to know where quiet areas, as perceived by citizens, so that such areas can be protected by the action plans. So this was, and we had, these were typical user stories that we wrote in a 3-hour workshop, or they coined, and we took note of them. In total, we collected 29 user stories. We classified them into different, that was the second step of data user stories analysis. So we classified them into some user stories that are related to data exploration, some are related to data enrichment, identification of areas in maps, defining of interventions or implementation of interventions, and more general user stories of collaboration. That was the first step, the more analytical step done by us, by the development team, not by the researchers or by the target group or the users. So analyzing what kind of user stories have we got? What are these user stories classified into? The next step was then to prioritize user stories, because it was clear, you may have thought, well, 29 user stories, if you put that all into one tool in the end as prototypes and as features, that will be a pretty comprehensive tool. And that's why, but also to find out what are the most important ones, we use this classification into identification, data exploration, data enrichment, intervention, and collaboration, and asked again in the second workshop our users, which of these user stories, we presented them all, and they had to say, is that a must-be critical user story? So it means a story that has to be implemented for sure. Is it a should be, could be, or won't be? So this is kind of Moscow, it's called, Moscow method. What is must be, should be, could be, won't be. And as you can see here, so from those total amount of 29 user stories, under identification, 5 were classified as must be. So it gives a priority for the developer which tools to start with, which are the most important features the tool is supposed to have. Next slide, next step then. So having that and having classified, we took each single user story and we made this kind of low fidelity prototype. So we made a sketching, how can this user story work on a map table in the tool? How can that be implemented? So to remind you, that was a user story that we started from. As a citizen, I want to show where I get influenced by the noise so that there are areas, these areas can get attention from the government. So for us, these user stories should look like, okay, we have here a table of content on our map table. They can pick a layer called noisy areas. Then they can digitize a point. This is a point where the citizen says, here I'm affected by noise. They can do different rankings. So what is the source of the noise, for instance? So they can say, like, what is the quality of the noise? Because that is from another user story we learned that was important for them. And they can even do, at the next step, add other information about that point. So that was how we envisioned this kind of user story to implement it as a piece of software, as a function, a feature in the tool to be developed. We showed that in the feedback session with the users again. We showed them this kind of mock-ups. They gave comment on that. We refined them again. So it was a very much an iterative process to define together with them all these different user stories. In the end, and now I jump a little bit to, I skip this coding part because much of the work that came then after having made this these mockups, much of the work had to be done by the software developer, in our case, the PhD student. But we ended up then having a tool that looks like this. Ogito is the type of the platform that we developed. We developed a prototype of a tool based on all the user stories that we collected before and how we operationalize it, how we define them. In the end, and I would like just to show a few studies, a few examples of the functionality of the tool. So in principle, our participatory noise action planning tool has 3 features. It allows to analyze the burden situation, the burden with respect to the levels of noise. It provides features derived from those user stories of mapping perceived noisy and quiet locations. And it also includes features that allow users to propose noise abatement measures, noise mitigation measures. So what kind of action shall be taken to reduce levels of noise or to preserve quiet areas? So all derived from the user stories, these features or these functions were the key elements of the tool we developed. And just to illustrate that a little bit, so this is one of the features. It basically shows a noise map, and here in the legend you see this kind of levels of noise, while the bluish areas in the case study area are the most noisy places. I mean, of course, if you're familiar with reading maps a little bit, here's a highway cutting through the entire area, and that of course has huge levels of noise. And well, on the other end, at the end of the legend, there are some areas which are shown here in white, which is basically not impacted by any levels of noise at all, or not above 55 dB. Why do we show dB? Why do we show, well, classes up to 55 or starting from 55 dB decibel? Because the WHO recommends or says, well, any noise level, permanent noise level that you're exposed to above 55 decibel is in the long run already affecting your health condition. So that's why it was our task, or the task in the noise action planning was to map where are areas that are above 55 decibel. And now I show a couple of other features that we include in the tool. That is, for instance, that helps well, it's a feature that we built in based on one user story where they said, we want to know how much is the population affected. And this map here shows the areas that are affected and the population density in these areas affected by a certain level of noise. So the feature is like, you can ask how much of the population is affected from noise levels above 55 or 65 or 75 dB, and then the map gives you feedback. This amount of population and where they are, and that's where no population is affected or exposed to these levels of noise. This next feature is, and sorry for it being in German, I'm afraid some of you might not be able to read it, but it was a German case study. This next feature shows a map, a screenshot of the tool as it is used for users to digitize, to add subjectively perceived levels of noisy places. So here they would click here, very much as you saw in the mock-up just before. So they first click here, make the layer noisy places, allow to order editable. Click here, they want to add a point, and then they click into the map, adding a point, and then they can add here, okay, what are the sources of noise? What is the intensity on a scale from 0 to 10? And what is the time of the day when this noise appears? So in the morning, over the day, in the evening, or at night, because it makes for noise action planners quite a difference when this noise happens. And that last slider, that last image shows the feature that we created from a user story, how users can then interact with the tool and suggest noise mitigation measures. So here, the different layer is requested. It's called measures, Maßnahmen. Again, you say, I want to edit something, then users add first a location and then suggest any of the measures that were predefined. So it's either a reduction of number of lanes on the road when the noise comes from the road, or it's covering redesigning the street with a particular type of silent coverage, silent asphalt, reducing the speed or while doing a park and ride, establishing a park and ride concept there to reduce a number of cars going on that street. So these are now the features, how they have been implemented in the tool after having co-designed them together with the users. That brings me to my second case study. I try to do it a bit quick because I'm seeing time is flying indeed very much. The second case study was on designing an inclusive collaborative mapping tool for mapping accessibility to public spaces for people with disabilities. So a completely different story. Here it's about like how can people with disabilities, and you see in our photo, in the photo here, our group of stakeholders there. This is a group of people with disabled people or people with disabilities from the city of Zwolle. Some of them sitting in a wheelchair. Some of them are having visual impairments, so close to being blind, and two of them even had auditive impairment. Our task, our goal in this study was to find out how can we design such tools, such a mapping tool on a map table that can be used for people with disabilities, and so that they can then contribute to the design of inclusive public spaces. So here, the second goal was what design requirements have people with disabilities for inclusive mapping tool. So here we address both levels of co-design. We co-design together with them the tool, which I will show in the next slide. But in the end, the tool should enable our stakeholders here, the users of the tool, to co-design public spaces that are more accessible for users in a wheelchair, being blind, or having auditive impairments. The case study group, the target group that we work with, of course, is of a different level and it's a different story. That's why here they would not be able to write any user stories as we did before. That's why we choose here a completely different approach to it. And what we did is we applied photo voice method. So we went out into the streets with them to capture issues of accessibility to public spaces. So to illustrate how we did that, we first defined together with them the route. That's the route that we walked together in the city of Zwolle for an hour and a half walk. And while we walked, they took photos. They took photos of issues that are barriers for them, that are problems for them. That informs us what are the issues that they want to capture with such a tool. So barriers like here, this is the scaffold on the sidewalk, problems of tables being put on guidelines in the bottom in the ground. So these are here guidelines for people working with a blind stick, or even streets with a cobblestone where people with a wheelchair can't go well. So they took a number of photos, and then we took these photos, we printed them, and discussed them together. What you see here on the photo in the lower right corner, we discussed all the photos from them. That is the photo voice method. The photo voice is first taking photos and then discussing them together. And from these discussions, we elicited user requirement. We listened to them and we heard these are the barriers that have to be mapped by the tool. And we also work with on the tool on the map table already, as you see here in the middle slide, to understand, to observe how people with a visual impairment, with an auditive impairment, can work with the tool. So different way here of co-designing, them telling their problems, making photos and describing, and us listening and eliciting user requirements for that. And the result that we obtained from them was, co-design together. What is the purpose of the tool at all? It's reporting of obstacles and problems of accessibility to public spaces online. So they go out now with a tool on an iPad and take photos and report such problems. But then afterwards, in a session together with different other stakeholders, the user-reported data shall be used in collaborative decision-making workshops. Just to illustrate a little bit how we organized this workshop or this tool development, We used the same platform as we had before seen in the other process. So it's Orgito, it's our mapping platform for the map table. We took sprints, agile development sprints of 4 to 6 weeks to design the process, to design the software solutions based on our user requirements, and then went back to our users to get their feedback on how it works for them, and they gave us comments on what we can change and what we have to reduce. And well, these were the user workshops. To summarize, these were all the different barriers and problems they encountered in space on their photos and that we had to map, and that we were developing functions for how to map these, because it's basically a mapping tool that we develop here. So traffic design, ramps, problems with pavement, problem with the guidelines, so these guidelines on the ground. I'm not going to read out loud all of them now. But I'm sure you can see the slides so you can study them more later in detail. Now again, to present results of this co-design process, this is a screenshot of the tool, how it worked. This time now it's in Dutch because it was a Dutch case study. It's the same interface as you saw before. They can here do reporting. Melding, it means reporting of issues. The way the tool works, so they first click here, I'm going to edit and report a location. Then I click on the map. In the map, well, after having made that point, you categorize or you classify this point that you just mapped to what category of barriers we just seen before does it refer to. So it's the same categories as I just showed before, but now in Dutch language. And then in addition to that, when they have clicked here, they can add a bit of textual description of that. The date is being recorded when that has been mapped. They can report whether it's a good example of solution or bad, so a problem. And they can even upload a photo because they said, like, we would like to demonstrate our photos, the problems that we see on the streets with photos. And then when it's done, they have finished the mapping. And that's what our stakeholders right now do in the city of Zwolle. And then in 3 weeks from now, we have the final workshop with the city municipality to discuss the results. You see here just now, once more, a couple of screenshots how the tool works. So here's a couple of the photos that they uploaded. Person on a wheelchair driving on the streets because there was no space for riding, well, on the footpaths next to it. And this is the feature. Well, they asked us to include a feature to search for streets. Here you have a search window where you can find particular streets because their spatial literacy is not that good that they can find any street, so they can just type Bach and then they find Bachlaan. And when they click here, then the map table, the map, it immediately jumps to that location. This is, for instance, the Bachlaan that we were just searching for. And finally, 2 more slides. Of course, for people with auditive or visual impairments, it's problematic to interact with such a screen as such. And that's why we also tried out different features. Here, a magnifier, for instance, to make the map better readable for people with auditive impairments, with visual impairments, sorry. And we also included, you see that button here below, a read out loud button, a feature. That's Microsoft implemented already, but we use it on the screen. So when you click here, then you click any of the text boxes, the text of the map or of the window is read out to you as a support for people with visual impairments. And last but not least, again, for people with visual impairments, they asked us to design the tool with higher contrast, so you can switch back between different contrast, whatever suits you best in visualizing the tool. I have one more slide and then I'm closing my session, and thanks for your patience on listening to the lecture. A couple of points to discuss. Well, first of all, I'm not showing that now in the lecture, but you can read the papers if you like. The co-design process in both resulted in a tailored tool, as you have seen. And afterwards, at least for the first project I presented, we assessed and we evaluated the usefulness of it. And the results that we got from our case studies was that the usefulness of the tool was assessed as being good. So, well, that's what you do co-design process for. You try to get tools that work well. Of course, as you can see from the examples, and I said that in the beginning in the definition, when you do co-design, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. The way you do the co-design depends on many factors, such as, well, the target group that you work with, experts or layperson, for instance, their knowledge and capabilities, but also time and resources and the goal of the process. In particular, the time process, the time aspect here is a critical issue that you need to consider when you do co-design, because it requires, as you can imagine from what I've just showed you, co-designing of tools is quite time consuming, and it's not for the researchers, but you also need stakeholders that are willing to spend so much time with you, because you have quite some demands for them to sit in sessions and give you feedback on the different versions of the tool. For the second case of the study on designing the tool for people with disabilities, recommendation requirements we elicited was not only regarding the software of it, the tool as such, or the application, but also regarding the hardware in the environment. When you sit on a web table, of course, you need the proper light above you. You need to be able to approach it with a wheelchair and other things. So requirements from a co-design process might be even go beyond the pure software requirements. And last but not least, several of the tool design requirements that we elicited and implemented in the second case study were also for average able people, because not everybody has a very good spatial literacy and can read maps well, and that's why it has even a broader impact in the long run. So I'd like to conclude my talk with, well, I am convinced, and you hope you can make that link. I hope you can make that link from my talk now. The co-designing of tools as I presented supports, in my view, very much also the co-design of plans and strategies, which then comes next, or our users in the Swallow case study do right now. Thanks a lot for your attention. That's my details. Feel free to ask or come back to me if you have any other questions or requests for the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Johannes. Given that the time, I propose that we do the questions at the end, so that we move straight to Nadia's presentation, because we are a little bit later than expected. Yep. So we have then the time of questions and answers after that presentation. So Nadia, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen now. So please tell me if you could see the presentation which I'm sharing.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Nice work.
Thank you a lot. So I am picking up here from Johannes, and I will continue the topic of co-creation of scenarios, and also will touch upon the tools and strategies. And before I dive to the methods which we are developing and examples from the projects, I just would like to put a background of our group, what we are doing. So our group is called Cooperation and Transformative Governance. And governance of climate change adaptation issues is in the center of our research. So where we look how decision-making processes under uncertainties are being formulated and shaped, and what kind of tools could support here in the decision-making processes, especially for so-called social dilemmas and weak policy issues, when we have several views, several positions of stakeholders, several priorities and preferences.
Zijn jullie lekker gebakken eitje aan het eten?
Ja.
Vandaag ga ik eten aan 11 uur. Ja, niet voor jou, hè?
Yeah, I think somebody has a microphone on.
Oh.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just please let me show you the models and tools which we are developing. So these are so-called cooperation models, the decision support systems, also based on participatory modeling and planning and participatory modeling. And here are the group of tools which we are providing for participatory and co-creation processes, which include game theoretical models for public goods and common pool management with various degrees of uncertainty. And usually such models, they could take into account, for example, different biases, cognitive and behavioral biases, such as bounded rationality, but also social heterogeneity, variety of positions of stakeholders and of lay people, which was also mentioned so explicitly before by Johannes in the previous presentation. Then the second group of the tools is the decision support systems, which help to structure the methods and which include prioritization of criteria and possibilities for trade-offs, for selection of various positions, for connections of drivers and criteria elicitations, and participatory modeling, which include multi-criteria optimization and participation, but also systems mapping, morphological analysis, participatory scenario planning. And here, about this third group of tools, I will be talking a little bit more in details and how they are contributing to co-creation of scenarios and of the strategies preparation. So if we speak in terms of implementation gap, and here I would like to say that we look to implementation gaps of the tools which was mentioned of Johannes, for example, how the tool which is being prepared is and being used by decision makers, but we also look at the implementation gaps in the policy and strategy processes, namely how these strategies are being implemented and what kind of governance solutions are needed. So how decision-making processes could be supported based on multi-criteria decision analysis, and how bridging parties could be built in a dialogue for development of a compromise solution. And here we don't say consensus, which we actually never use in our work of participatory scenario preparation, as we are assuming that reaching consensus is quite challenging, but we say a compromise process. And here I also would like to add that such kind of tools, they are stimulating for understanding of positions of different parties, for identifying trade-offs on different criteria, for helping bringing different parties together and achieving compromise on especially contested issues. So, diving into background of co-creation and co-design, which was also mentioned by Johannes explicitly in his presentation. So just to say a couple of words about the history, that co-creation is not a new terminology. So it was developed already starting from the 60s of the last century, or maybe even earlier. And from that time, the terminology was based synonymously for co-production, for co-creation, and for co-design. And fortunately, now we could see divergences of this terminology and using it in different areas of application. So the first applications were in business practices, in product design, but then afterwards it's also expanded to policy and to so-called citizen engagement. And I would like to touch upon this topic about citizen participation, citizen engagement, also a little bit during my presentation. So what is relevant now and how this term of co-production, co-creation, co-design changed? So the ongoing processes, such as different crises which we faced during the last years, but also environmental crises which raised awareness about participation, about co-creation, about engagement into policy, about possibility to shape policy. All this raised the need for discussion about co-creation. Another issue is also that in some areas the trust of the public institutions is being questioned, and participatory and Also citizen engagement is also required to contribute to provision of certain services which were previously considered as governmental services. Then we also see that there is a need for more efficient and effective and democratic public services and values, and here tools of co-creation and engagement are also helpful. But also nowadays, technological solutions and especially ICT, they are also facilitating this co-creation and engagement. So we could see different kinds of e-budget, of e-participation, of IT tools which could stimulate citizen science, co-creation processes, debating on different values, reaching the compromise on different issues. So where the co-creation takes place usually? So it could be at the process of the idea generation, and it could be also at the moment of decision making or implementation. If we look at policy, we divide policy also different parts. So co-creation could appear from the moment of designing of policy intervention, but also then at the moment of implementation, shaping, developing details for the policy implementation. And here we worked on in various areas and on various policies in the health sector, in climate change adaptation, also in sectorial policies such as energy policy, for example. And we saw that they allow different kinds of co-creations in different processes. So if some policies would not allow co-creation at the moment of the settlement of the policy, then some certain degree of co-creation would be possible at the moment of the policy implementation and discussion on the design and peculiarities of particular projects. So here you could see the evolvement of understanding of participation during different axes, which we are usually using to understand how participation and co-creation is taking place. So you could see it could be diversified through involvement, such as active involvement or less active involvement, collaborative involvement. Here we are speaking about co-creation and participation between different stakeholders, also involving lay people into policy formulation. Then we could see also where co-creation is situated, so its intensity of collaborations, of social ties, they're also influencing this participatory strategy and scenario preparation. So you could see the placemaking, which would be stronger or less strong, formalized or less formalized. And here we use different methods such as social network analysis, for example, to understand these different parts of institutional structure which allow co-creation. We could see also different ingredients and key ingredients which are important to understand co-creation and features of co-creation, such as assets, for example, how people perceive and stakeholders. So here I'm speaking about two groups and two possibilities for co-creation. One is stakeholders, experts, and in some processes, lay people are also considered as experts. Another one is focused purely on lay people with different peculiarities and understanding of different features of social groups. So if such possibilities exist, if stakeholders / lay people believe that they could participate, that they could engage, what kind of capacities we have, what kind of networks exist, what kind of catalysts. So all these questions should be addressed before designing the policy intervention scenario, strategy, and also designing the way of its implementation. So if we go from the co-creation to co-design, and this difference was also mentioned very well and clearly in the presentation of Johannes. So co-design is a specific instance of co-creation. So this is where this process of creativity is taking place, from the design criteria to ideas to concepts, prototypes, and finally products. And I just here would like to show a couple of examples how these co-design processes were proposed from the phase of understanding, like framing and context map. And I think I will not be going here into more details because it was already explicitly highlighted in the previous presentation. then to ideas and to collaborative mind mapping, and maps were also mentioned already before, to co-paths, to the storytelling, which is used both in the tools preparations, but also in scenarios, in serious games, in serious plays, to the user journeys, prototyping, and then defining of the product. As another example, I would like to show the methodology which was developed by our partners from the Stockholm University on co-creation and co-designing processes, which include different steps which they formed in so-called non-linear feedback loops, and each step is feeding to the next one, like starting from the first one. And here, this methodology was explicitly developed for involving citizens into the process of co-creation. So identification of challenges at the first step, go into so-called open innovation jam sessions, which could have different formats, then to concept visualization jointly. And here different methods and tools could be applied, such as a famous what-if scenario, which is now getting as a tool more and more popular in policy formulation, with various kinds of visualizations, maps, which was also already discussed previously. Then go into the sandboxing of ideas, testing of ideas, validation and evaluation of these ideas, to interactive development with citizen participation and so-called creation of solutions, and to prototyping and then preparation for the market implementation, if we talk here about a particular product. So here this is also the map which shows all these steps and how from the broader diversity of ideas using various tools and methods we get so stronger and stronger shaped into one of particular ideas, design, product, policy intervention. And here you could see the variety of tools and methods which could be applied for this, and there is a whole science behind each of them. So it's a brainstorming, like focus groups, using various kinds of stakeholder interactions. We have empathy maps, we have what-if scenarios, organizational chart diagrams, Philips 66, which is also an interesting tool with an interesting name, meta plans, significant changes, opinion survey, desired futures, focus groups again, and scenario planning. Just also before I'm going to the example of concrete projects, I also would like to touch upon the terminology of stakeholder, and we frequently in our practice we meet with this question. So what do we actually mean with stakeholder participation? And any kind of co-creation and co-design process should actually start with the thorough stakeholder mapping. And there are different criteria of the mapping, and finally the product of the mapping, it should be transparent, so it should be clear why certain stakeholders were selected for participation, how they were engaged. But yeah, just to start with the mapping, so a number of questions should be addressed before this map is being developed. So what is the process and who is the stakeholder? And there are different features of how we could evaluate the stakeholder. Do we speak about formal, informal participation? Do we speak about particular features of policy intervention? And just to highlight that stakeholder mapping is not a technical tool for the co-creation, but it's an essential part of the co-creation process. And the entire co-creation process will depend, the outcomes will depend very much on how in details and thoroughly the stakeholder mapping is being done. And this mapping could include different issues. It could include social diagrams. It could include various needs of stakeholders, their stories, visions, their perceptions. So yeah, it's then dependent on the task and on the strategy which is being developed. Yeah, so going to disaster risk reduction, while speaking about multi-risk in in the previous years, we developed a so-called disaster risk reduction cycle, which was based very much on the methodology on Ortwin Rand to show how different stakeholders could be engaged into various kinds and various phases of disaster risk reduction process and multi-risk governance, with communication and stakeholder participation being a major part of this cycle. And here I would like to speak about different parts of the cycle, so different phases, and why do we need actually to engage the stakeholders, and different formats how the stakeholders could be involved while providing them for platform for co-creation, for cooperation, starting from the different kinds of multi-risk commissions, bringing different knowledges together, but also creating of platforms where stakeholders, including academia, business, local communities, could cooperate together in co-designing policies and strategies. And as an example, and touching upon the implementation gap, which was mentioned so explicitly and well by Johannes, I just would like to show one example from this project when a wonderful tool on multi-risk assessment decision support system was developed by Arnaud Mignon, which was called Virtual City. And the idea of the tool was to show cascading and conjoint impacts of multiple risks in frames of a given territory. So here we don't speak about interconnected infrastructure, but we just limit itself on a certain territory. So the tool was not, it was complex, but not so much if we would take also interactions with other territories. And we conducted a number of decision-making experiments with disaster risk reduction authorities, mainly at national level in various countries of the European Union. So you could see here the map of the countries which were involved. Actually, what we found out at the time was quite shocking for us, that perceptions of stakeholders, of practitioners and academia on how this DSS could be used were actually very, very different, so very divergent. And we asked them a number of questions, we tried the tool, we tested the tool, so we conducted decision-making experiments. And here you could see that the tool was recommended for communication and raising of awareness, but actually it was quite problematic to use it for optimization and allocation of resources. For example, even though here the perceptions between academia and practitioners varied significantly. And we followed with a number of interactions, further interactions with stakeholders, and based on their feedback, based on their active engagement and co-creation, this tool was developed further. So just to add here, why is it so important to involve co-creation processes into policy planning? Because currently there are a number of challenges which characterize the policy planning. The first one is a deep uncertainty, lack of availability of data, ambiguity of the problem, incompleteness of data, requirement of the policy feasibility and ownership by stakeholders, and also urgency in providing solutions. And we argue here, and it also goes in line with the previous presentation, that co-creation processes, of course, they require time, they require resources, but they also could contribute to finding solutions to these identified challenges. So here I would like to show you the systems analysis toolkit, which was developed by our group, and which we tested in several projects, and we find out that the toolkit helps in several ways, so to structure the problem and to assist in sense making in the policy processes, to find compromise between different stakeholders and also preferences and trade-offs between different options, and to provide social learning when different stakeholders and different social groups are brought together. So this tool has several steps from the selection and prioritization of criteria and preferences. So what actually matter for different stakeholders, if we take, for example, local versus national stakeholders. And here I would like to add that if we speak about complex policy solutions in their entirety, it might be challenging for a stakeholder from the beginning to say that, for example, option A is better than option B. It might be more possible to say that criteria of this option is more preferable than criteria of some other option. So that is why it's important to break the complex process into a number of criteria and then evaluate the preferences according to this criteria. Then at once we understand what matters mostly for different groups of people, and we could have here different methods of analysis, including negotiations, including games, including, for example, compromise building exercises between different groups. We could then go to the selection and system mapping of factors, then to formulation and prioritization of strategic goals and priorities, to formulation of plausible scenarios with identification of all risk, but also of possible risk mitigation measures in short, medium, and long-term perspective, and then with selection or suggestion of robust policy options. And I just would like to show how this methodology was used. So here are the methods which we mentioned earlier and which include different steps. So competing goals at the first step, then identification of the boundaries of the system, and here system could be a sector, could be a national system, could be a certain geographical location, like in the case of the model which was developed by Arno, which was a certain city, virtual city. Then identification of the uncertain factors of the system, sketching the plausible futures, and scenario identification based on co-creation processes, on stakeholder involvement, and identification of portfolio of actions. And I just would like to highlight that each of these steps includes preferences and participations of stakeholders. So here just an examples where we used this methodology in policies. So one was the preparation of the strategy of sustainable industrial development in Central Asia for Kyrgyzstan, which was based on this participatory scenario planning. And then the results were provided for discussion. It was discussed in the parliament during 1 year and then became recommendations which were which were developed as a result of this scenario preparations, then became the basis of the law about industry in Kyrgyzstan. And the second one is a policy work and guideline on the so-called water energy nexus and identification of priorities, which was provided with Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So here you could just see the example of so-called system maps when different factors and the linkages were mapped together, also based on the methods of participatory planning. So if I go, and I'm just checking on the time, and sorry if I'm overtaking my time, so just go into this multi-criteria decision analysis. So there are different arguments in different areas where it could be used. So it could help in problem structuring, in preferences elicitation, and we used MCDA between different groups, but also it could be also used even for a single stakeholder when he or she faces a complex issue for selection between different criteria for prioritization of actions, for example, even for budget planning. So even for such issues, the tools could be used. Then it goes to aggregation, to sensitivity analysis, and to final decision and recommendations. So it helps to settle priorities, and it could help to identify, for example, which scenarios have the highest risk according to preferences and perceptions of stakeholders. It could help to characterize scenarios, and it could also help to develop the weights for different criteria which are relevant for this scenario. So here you could see the arguments for multi-criteria decision optimization and why we are applying it in policy, such as, for example, that MCDA helps to divide the complex decision-making process into certain criteria. It also helps to include transparency of the decision-making processes, because then you could see what matter for which criteria at which step. It also increases legitimacy of decision-making outcomes, because stakeholders, they were already involved into this process. They had an opportunity to contribute. They had an opportunity to discuss and to understand arguments of each other. And it also addresses the perceptions of procedural justice, meaning how stakeholders are being involved, if their choices and voices were heard, and what were the outcomes of the decision-making process itself. So here you could see an example of a project when we were asked to contribute to the strategy preparation for the energy sector in 3 countries in the Middle East and North African region, and the strategy preparation was based on such participatory scenario planning, when several criteria were developed and sub-criteria, and then further on, in course of decision-making experiments, weights of these criteria were identified based on the positions of stakeholders. So here you could also see differences. This is the so-called criteria map, which shows how different could be positions of stakeholder groups according to certain criteria. So up to really very polarized, like you could see for someone, criteria could have high importance, but for another group, this criterion could have a least importance. And this is where the compromise is needed to be achieved. An example, so if we develop the policy intervention with the least possible impact on environment, or with the least possible costs. So these are 2 competing criteria, and this is where the debate between different groups could be stimulated. So here you could see also during the rounds of decision-making experiments how these criterions were moved by different groups. And in this case, for example, the compromise solution was not really possible, because the positions were, with each argument and with each round of the game, it was more and more far away from each other. And this is a situation where we also have to live with during the co-creation processes when we start them, that it's not an assumption per se that a compromise could be reached by the end of the process itself. But the process is also valuable because it facilitates learning, it facilitates exchange of information, it facilitates understanding of positions of each other. This slide shows how our MCDA maps look like after these decision-making experiments and after we applied our mathematical model to understand what the weights and what really matter for different stakeholder groups. So we could see here which scenario or strategy is most preferable for all groups and what kind of criterion is playing the most important role for this strategy, and where trade-offs are also possible. So just, I don't know if I have a couple of minutes, I just maybe touch shortly upon also co-creation and engagement with the public, which is also an important issue. And here, just to show the structure which we developed, the so-called scheme of public acceptance, also in the area of co-creation, which is a subject of several components, such as perceptions of socio-economic impacts, of environmental impacts, of distributive justice, which is the co-creation engagement process of trust, of participation, and information. And all this contradicts the so-called NIMBY concept, not in my backyard, which is currently more and more being described by social scientists as some kind of really pejorative attitude towards the positions of people on the ground who are affected by the policy interventions. Going briefly to the methods of analysis of co-creation with the public. So here is the famous ladder of Einstein, which was developed already in 1969 and adapted several times, and which shows different degrees of co-creation and involvement of public, starting from manipulation to citizen control. And I would say we mapped several projects according to this ladder of Einstein. And what we could say is that tokenism is currently the most frequent level of participation in different places, but in Europe also. And here is the scheme for development of public co-creation and engagement, starting from the communication and awareness-raising measures, how they should be formulated, the guidelines, so going from more general to more particular, from global to local, strengthening the targets to each group, going then to engagement, how these engagement opportunities should be provided in which parts of the decision methods, and to the attitudes towards the project. Yeah, and with this, I would like to finish here. So here you could see my contact information. In case you have questions, would be happy to address them. And sorry if I overtook the time.